In the summer of 1944, as Allied armies broke out of Normandy and surged across France, many German commanders remained confident that the advance would soon collapse under its own weight. Their confidence did not come from optimism about German strength, but from deep skepticism toward American logistics. German military doctrine, shaped by rail-based supply systems and rigid timetables, viewed long-distance motorized resupply as inefficient, fragile, and unsustainable under combat conditions. To German planners, the idea that the United States could support fast-moving armored formations hundreds of kilometers from major ports seemed unrealistic. They believed fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and road congestion would inevitably halt any rapid advance. This assumption appeared reasonable in theory. The destruction of French rail infrastructure, the limited capacity of captured ports, and the sheer scale of Allied forces posed enormous logistical challenges. German intelligence reports noted these constraints and concluded that American momentum would fade once supply lines stretched too far inland. Many German generals openly mocked what they considered American over-reliance on trucks and improvisation, expecting logistics, not German resistance, to stop the Allied drive. What German commanders failed to grasp was how central logistics had become to American operational thinking. Unlike European armies accustomed to fixed supply nodes, the U.S. Army had embraced mobility as a logistical principle. American planners understood that speed itself could offset vulnerability, provided supplies moved continuously. This mindset led to the creation of an unprecedented solution, the Red Ball Express. Beginning in late August 1944, thousands of trucks operated around the clock on dedicated routes between Normandy and the advancing front. Priority roads were closed to civilian traffic, military police enforced strict movement discipline, and drivers were ordered to keep moving regardless of exhaustion or mechanical strain. Fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts flowed forward in massive quantities, often delivered directly to frontline units. The system was crude, inefficient by peacetime standards, and brutally demanding on personnel, but it worked. German intelligence underestimated both its scale and its resilience. What appeared chaotic was in fact a deliberate gamble, trading long-term wear for immediate operational freedom. As Patton's Third Army advanced faster than German defenses could reorganize, it became increasingly clear that American logistics were not collapsing, they were accelerating. For German commanders, watching the situation develop, this realization came too late. The assumption that supply shortages would impose natural limits on Allied operations shaped German defensive planning in critical weeks. Units were redeployed with the expectation that American spearheads would soon pause. Counterattacks were delayed, reserves withheld, and fallback positions chosen based on anticipated logistical exhaustion rather than enemy capability. When the expected pause never came, German forces found themselves reacting to events instead of shaping them. Patton's rapid advances across France were not simply tactical successes, they were logistical victories that invalidated German assumptions at every level of command. The Red Ball Express did not eliminate shortages or inefficiencies, but it sustained momentum long enough to prevent German recovery. By the time German generals fully acknowledged the effectiveness of American supply methods, the operational balance had shifted irreversibly. The war in Western Europe would not be decided by who planned supply most elegantly, but by who could keep moving longest under pressure. As the Red Ball Express expanded in September 1944, its impact became impossible for German commanders to ignore. What had begun as an emergency improvisation evolved into a massive, continuous flow of supplies that sustained the fastest armored advance of the Western Front. Thousands of trucks driven day and night compensated for destroyed railways and limited port capacity. Fuel in particular became the decisive factor. American armored units consumed vast quantities of gasoline, yet shortages rarely forced long operational pauses. German field reports increasingly noted that U.S. spearheads resumed movement far sooner than expected, often after only brief refueling halts. This pattern contradicted every assumption German planners had made about logistical exhaustion. Attempts to disrupt the supply network through air attacks and sabotage achieved little. Allied air superiority made large-scale interdiction nearly impossible, while the sheer redundancy of the truck system absorbed losses without collapse. To German staff officers trained to protect centralized depots and rail hubs, the decentralized American model appeared wasteful, but it proved resilient under pressure. Every kilometer gained by Patton's forces extended the logistical challenge, yet the Red Ball Express adapted rather than failed. Routes shifted, schedules tightened, and enforcement grew harsher, but the flow continued. German commanders watching the advance were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. American logistics were no longer a limiting factor. They were an enabling weapon, transforming industrial capacity into operational speed. This realization undermined defensive planning across France, where expectations of an inevitable supply pause had shaped troop dispositions and response timing. It also forced German commanders to reassess assumptions about American adaptability, revealing a system capable of learning faster than German defenses could recover or reorganize under constant pressure during the critical weeks following the Normandy breakout, when momentum proved decisive for the campaign in France. 1944 operations. For German field commands, the consequences of this miscalculation were immediate and severe. Defensive lines were established on the assumption that Allied spearheads would soon halt to regroup, allowing German units time to consolidate and counterattack. Instead, Patton's Third Army continued advancing, often bypassing resistance rather than engaging it head-on. This mobility magnified German disarray. Units arrived at planned defensive positions only to discover they were already threatened from the flanks or rear. Fuel shortages plagued German formations instead, reversing expectations entirely. While American trucks delivered gasoline forward, German armored units increasingly lacked it, immobilizing tanks and forcing withdrawals on foot. The Red Ball Express thus created an asymmetry German planners had not anticipated, one side accelerating through logistical strain, the other paralyzed by it. Attempts to stabilize the front along natural barriers failed as American momentum denied German commanders the time required to organize coherent defenses. Intelligence assessments were revised, but revisions came too late to alter outcomes. By early September, it was clear that logistics had become a decisive operational factor, not a secondary concern. The American system, though inefficient on paper, proved ruthless in execution, sacrificing vehicles, tires, and manpower to preserve tempo. German doctrine, reliant on orderly supply and predictable pauses, could not adapt quickly enough. The mocked American approach had turned mobility into dominance. What German generals had dismissed as reckless improvisation now shaped the battlefield. The Red Ball Express did not merely support Patton's advance, it defined it. By sustaining speed beyond German expectations, it collapsed defensive planning and accelerated the liberation of France, marking a turning point where logistical innovation outweighed traditional operational theory entirely. By mid-September 1944, the consequences of German misjudgment had fully unfolded. The Red Ball Express had done more than sustain an advance. It had reshaped the tempo of the campaign in Western Europe. German commanders now faced a reality they had not planned for, an enemy that refused to slow down. American armored units exploited gaps faster than German headquarters could identify them, let alone respond. The speed of movement disrupted every layer of German command, from frontline coordination to theater-level planning. Orders arrived too late, reserves were committed piecemeal, and defensive concepts built around phased withdrawals collapsed. German generals had assumed logistics would impose natural pauses, moments when American forces would be forced to stop, reorganize, and expose themselves. Instead, Patton's Third Army maintained near-continuous pressure, denying the Germans the operational breathing space their doctrine depended on. This constant motion magnified the effects of Allied air superiority, as German columns attempting to reposition were exposed on roads while American supply traffic moved under protective planning and prioritization. What had been mocked as an unsophisticated system revealed its true strength. It was designed not for elegance, but for endurance under chaos. The strain, however, was immense, and German intelligence did begin to detect it. Trucks broke down at alarming rates, drivers collapsed from exhaustion, and spare parts were consumed faster than they could be replaced. Yet this did not produce the collapse German commanders had predicted. Instead, American leadership accepted degradation as the cost of momentum. Vehicles were abandoned rather than repaired, roads were chewed into dust, and personnel were pushed to their limits. From a German perspective, this willingness to accept waste bordered on madness. From an American perspective, it was calculated risk. Industrial depth and manpower reserves made such losses tolerable in the short term if they delivered decisive operational advantage. German generals, constrained by shrinking resources and rigid supply doctrine, could not mirror this approach. Their own logistical system, already damaged by Allied bombing, lacked flexibility. Fuel shortages immobilized divisions at critical moments, turning planned counterattacks into static defenses or outright retreats. The contrast was stark. While American logistics burned themselves forward, German logistics simply ran out. By the time German command fully understood the scale of American commitment to speed, the opportunity to exploit logistical weakness had passed. This imbalance had cascading effects on morale and decision-making within the German command structure. Reports from the front increasingly reflected frustration and disbelief. Units were ordered to hold positions they could neither supply nor reinforce. Commanders on the ground recognized that the initiative had been lost not because of tactical inferiority, but because German planning had rested on assumptions that no longer applied. The Red Ball Express forced German generals to confront a modern form of warfare in which logistics were not a constraint to be managed conservatively, but a weapon to be expended aggressively. This realization arrived as German resources were already in irreversible decline. The Western Front was no longer a problem that could be stabilized through clever redeployment or localized counterattacks. Momentum itself had become the decisive factor, and momentum now belonged to the Allies. German generals had not merely underestimated American logistics, they had misunderstood the philosophy behind them. The Red Ball Express embodied an operational culture willing to sacrifice efficiency for speed, preservation for pressure. By the autumn of 1944, this miscalculation had stripped German command of strategic options. What remained was reactive defense against an enemy whose supply system, once dismissed as fragile, had proven capable of sustaining relentless advance long enough to break the back of German resistance in France. By October 1944, the effects of the Red Ball Express were no longer measured only in kilometers gained, but in the strategic collapse of German options in Western Europe. The German High Command had expected time for new defensive lines to solidify, time for reserves to arrive, time for Allied momentum to exhaust itself. That time never came. The American advance, sustained by an unrelenting flow of fuel and supplies, compressed German decision-making into a constant state of crisis. Positions that were meant to serve as temporary holding lines became final stands. Withdrawal plans were overtaken by events. German generals found themselves issuing orders that acknowledged reality too late, reacting to breakthroughs rather than anticipating them. The Red Ball Express did not make Patton's Third Army invincible, but it denied German command the pauses upon which their entire defensive calculus depended. Even when American forces finally slowed in the autumn due to port shortages and stretched infrastructure, the damage was already done. France had been liberated faster than German planners believed possible, and the opportunity to stabilize the Western Front on favorable terms had vanished. The deeper lesson, recognized quietly within German command circles, was that logistics had become inseparable from operational philosophy. German doctrine treated supply as a prerequisite to action, something that had to be secured before movement could occur. American doctrine, as demonstrated by the Red Ball Express, treated supply as something that could be forced forward through will, prioritization, and industrial depth. This difference proved decisive. German generals had mocked American logistics because they judged it by traditional standards of efficiency and sustainability. They failed to account for an enemy willing to expend trucks, fuel, and human endurance to maintain tempo at all costs. By the time German commanders adjusted their assessments, the balance of initiative had shifted permanently. The Red Ball Express was eventually scaled back, and its toll on men and machines became apparent, but its purpose had been fulfilled. It had carried Allied forces far enough, fast enough to prevent German recovery. In retrospect, German generals did not lose the campaign in France solely because of battlefield defeats. They lost it because they underestimated a logistical system designed not to endure indefinitely, but to win decisively in the narrow window where speed mattered most.